In the winter of 1932, 1 in 4 American households had no steady income at all. In the shanty towns that formed on the edges of cities, families cooked over open fires with whatever remained in the pantry, stretching to ingredients into a meal that could feed an entire household for a week. These dinners were never written into cookbooks. They were memorized out of necessity, passed down in silence, and slowly erased as prosperity returned. 12 of them survived, buried in church records, family diaries, and the memory of those who lived through the hunger. Every one of them uses only 2 ingredients. Every one of them was born from genuine desperation, and every one of them still works today. Starting with the dish that fed an entire generation of forgotten men. Number 1. Hoover Stew. 2 ingredients, hot dogs and elbow macaroni. During the Great Depression, families in shantytowns known as Hoovervilles stretched a single package of hot dogs across an entire pot of macaroni, creating a meal that was filling, cheap, and endlessly repeatable. The result was not elegant, but it was survival, and it remains one of the most quietly satisfying dinners a person can make with almost nothing in the pantry. Here is what you need. 1 pound of hot dogs, sliced into thin rounds. 2 cups of elbow macaroni, uncooked. Bring a large pot of salted water to a boil, and add the macaroni. Cook according to the package instructions until just tender, then drain, reserving a small cup of the starchy cooking water. Return the empty pot to medium-high heat, and add the sliced hot dogs directly, with no oil required. Let them sit undisturbed for 2 full minutes. This step matters more than any other in the dish. The hot dogs must render their own fat and develop a deep golden edge before they are moved. Once browned on one side, stir and cook for another 2 minutes until color appears on every piece. Return the drained macaroni to the pot with the browned hot dogs. Add a splash of the reserved starchy water, and toss everything together over low heat until the pasta takes on the rendered fat and brown bits from the bottom of the pot. Special tips from my side about this ingredient: do not rush the browning. A hot dog that is simply heated through tastes like nothing. A hot dog that is properly seared in its own fat tastes like something worth remembering, even 80 years later. Number 2. Chipped beef on milk gravy. 2 ingredients, dried beef and milk. Soldiers in the 1940s called it by a far cruder name, one that could not be printed in any newspaper, and simply referred to it as SOS. It began as a Depression-era kitchen economy and became a staple of military mess halls for the same reason. 2 inexpensive ingredients, properly handled, could feed a man completely and keep him standing through a long day of work. Here is what you need. 4 ounces of dried beef, thinly sliced or torn into small pieces. 2 cups of whole milk. Heat a dry pan over medium heat, and add the dried beef directly, with no oil or butter required. Let it cook undisturbed for about 2 minutes, allowing the edges to curl and crisp slightly. This step draws out the salt and concentrates the flavor of the beef before the milk ever touches the pan. Sprinkle a light dusting of flour over the beef, just enough to coat it, and stir for 30 seconds until the flour disappears into the fat. Pour in the milk slowly, stirring continuously as it heats. The mixture will look thin at first and thicken steadily over the next 4 to 5 minutes as it comes to a gentle simmer. Continue stirring until the gravy coats the back of a spoon and the beef is suspended evenly throughout rather than sitting at the bottom. Make sure to follow these steps during the preparation of chipped beef on milk gravy. Crisping the beef before the milk goes in is the difference between a forgettable gray gravy and a genuinely savory one. Skip that step, and the dish tastes like nothing more than warm milk. Serve spoon generously over toast, and let the bread soak in every drop. Moving to number 3, poor man's fudge. 2 ingredients, cocoa powder and sweetened condensed milk. In households where butter and sugar were rationed or simply unaffordable, this dessert became a small act of defiance against hardship. A single can of condensed milk, already sweetened and thickened, replaced the cream, sugar, and butter that traditional fudge required, and the result was a dense, glossy candy that tasted like celebration during a decade that offered very little of it. Here is what you need. 1 14-ounce can of sweetened condensed milk. Half a cup of unsweetened cocoa powder. Line a small dish or loaf pan with parchment paper and set it aside. Pour the condensed milk into a small saucepan over low heat. Add the cocoa powder directly into the cold milk before turning up the heat, whisking continuously until no dry pockets remain and the mixture turns a deep, uniform brown. Raise the heat to medium and continue whisking without pause. The mixture will begin to thicken and pull slightly away from the sides of the pan after about 4 minutes. This is the moment it is ready, not a second later. Pour the thickened mixture immediately into the lined pan, working quickly before it begins to set in the saucepan itself. Smooth the top with the back of a spoon and let it rest at room temperature for 1 hour, then transfer to the refrigerator for at least 2 hours until fully firm. Listen carefully. Whisking without interruption is the entire secret of this recipe. The moment the mixture is left unattended overheat, it scorches on the bottom and turns bitter. Working quickly once it thickens prevents it from setting inside the pan, where it becomes nearly impossible to remove cleanly. Number 4. Prune whipped. Ingredients: prunes and egg whites. This dessert reached both civilian tables and hospital trays throughout the early 20th century, prized not for indulgence, but for the fact that it required almost no sugar, no dairy, and no flour, only 2 ingredients that a struggling household nearly always had on hand. What emerged from that scarcity was, unexpectedly, one of the lightest and most elegant desserts of its era, whipped into a texture closer to a souffle than a simple stewed fruit. Here is what you need. 1 cup of pitted prunes, softened. 2 large egg whites, at room temperature. Place the softened prunes in a small saucepan with a splash of water and simmer over low heat for 8 minutes until they break down into a thick, jam-like paste. Remove from heat and mash thoroughly with a fork, then set aside to cool completely. This cooling step is essential, since warm prune paste will deflate the egg whites the moment they are combined. In a clean, dry bowl, beat the egg whites with an electric mixer or whisk until stiff peaks form, meaning the whites hold their shape firmly when the whisk is lifted away. Once the prune paste has cooled fully, fold it gently into the whipped egg whites in 3 additions, using broad, slow strokes rather than stirring to preserve as much air as possible. Spoon the finished mixture into small serving glasses and chill for at least 1 hour before serving. Follow these tips for a better experience. Cold prune paste and properly stiff egg whites are non-negotiable. Skip either condition, and the whip collapses into a dense, flat mixture rather than the airy dessert this recipe is known for. Number 5. Water peat. Ingredients: water and flour, set into a pie crust with sugar and a touch of vanilla stirred through. During the driest years of the Depression, when milk, eggs, and cream were often out of reach entirely, resourceful cooks discovered that a thickened mixture of water and flour, sweetened generously, could bake into something that closely resembled a custard pie. It became known in some regions simply as desperation pie, a name that spoke plainly to the circumstances that created it. Here is what you need. 1½ cups of water. 3 tablespoons of all-purpose flour, plus a prepared pie crust to hold the filling. Preheat the oven to 350 degrees. In a saucepan, whisk the flour into a small amount of the water first, working out every lump before adding the remaining water. This order matters, since flour added directly to a full pot of water clumps immediately and never fully dissolves. Whisk in the sugar and vanilla, Then place the saucepan over medium heat, stirring constantly as the mixture heats. After about 6 minutes, it will thicken into a smooth, pourable custard base. Pour the warm filling directly into the prepared pie crust and smooth the top evenly. Bake for 35 minutes, until the surface turns a light golden color and the center has set with only a slight wobble remaining. Number 6. Mock apple pitwo. Ingredients: buttery crackers and a lemon sugar syrup set inside a pie crust. This recipe endures as one of the strangest and most talked about survivors of the Depression era, a dessert built entirely on illusion. With real apples scarce or unaffordable in many regions, home cooks discovered that crushed crackers, soaked in a spiced syrup and baked beneath a crust, produced a filling that tasted astonishingly almost identical to apple pie, despite containing no apple at all. Here is what you need: 36 buttery round crackers, roughly crushed, 1½ cups of a sugar and lemon syrup, made from water, sugar, lemon juice, and a touch of cinnamon, plus a prepared pie crust. Preheat the oven to 400 degrees. In a saucepan, combine the water, sugar, lemon juice, and cinnamon, and bring to a gentle boil, stirring until the sugar fully dissolves and the syrup thickens slightly, about 5 minutes. Remove from heat and let it cool for 10 minutes. This resting time matters, since pouring boiling syrup directly over the crackers turns them to mush rather than allowing them to hold their shape. Layer the crushed crackers evenly into the prepared pie crust, then pour the cool syrup slowly and evenly over the top, allowing it to soak into every piece. Cover with a second crust, seal the edges, and cut several small vents on top. Bake for 30 minutes, until crust turns deep golden brown. Number 7. Milk or no. 2 ingredients: cornmeal and powdered milk. Developed by nutrition researchers at Cornell University during the depths of the Depression, this dish was distributed through relief programs as one of the most nutritionally complete meals a family could make for pennies. It was never intended to be memorable. It was intended to keep people alive, and for thousands of households in the 1930s, it quietly did exactly that. Here is what you need: 1 cup of cornmeal, 1 cup of powdered milk, reconstituted into 2½ cups of liquid milk. Pour the reconstituted milk into a saucepan and bring it to a gentle simmer over medium heat. Add the cornmeal in a slow, steady stream while whisking continuously, never all at once. Pouring it in gradually is the step that prevents the mixture from seizing into hard lumps the moment it meets the hot milk. Continue whisking for about 2 minutes as the cornmeal begins to soften and the mixture starts to thicken. Reduce the heat to low and let it cook gently for 15 minutes, stirring every few minutes to prevent the bottom from catching. The finished texture should be thick enough to hold its shape briefly on a spoon, similar to a soft polenta. Remove from heat and let it rest for 2 minutes before serving, as it will continue to thicken slightly off the heat. Special tips you should follow during the preparation of this great meal: adding the cornmeal slowly rather than dumping it in is what separates a smooth, creamy result from a lumpy, gritty one. Patience during those first 2 minutes determines the texture of the entire dish. Number 8. Hard Times Pudding. 2 ingredients: stale bread and molasses. Long before the Depression, this dish had already earned its name during earlier periods of economic hardship in America, and it resurfaced again in the 1930s for the same reason it always had. Nothing in a household kitchen went to waste, and bread that had gone hard and unappetizing could be transformed, with a single pantry staple, into something warm, dark, and genuinely comforting. Here is what you need: 4 cups of stale bread torn into small pieces, 3/4 of a cup of molasses, thinned with a small amount of water. Preheat the oven to 350 degrees and lightly grease a baking dish. Place the torn bread into the dish in an even layer. In a small saucepan, warm the molasses gently with the water over low heat for 2 minutes, just until it loosens and becomes easy to pour, taking care not to let it boil. Pour the warm molasses slowly and evenly over the bread, making sure every piece is touched by the liquid rather than pooling in one corner. Press the bread down gently with the back of a spoon so it begins absorbing the molasses immediately. Let it sit undisturbed for 10 minutes before baking, allowing the driest pieces to soak up as much liquid as possible. Bake for 25 minutes, until the top has darkened slightly and the edges have turned firm and slightly crisp. Letting the bread rest in the molasses before it goes into the oven is the step most people skip, and the one that determines whether the pudding turns out evenly moist or dry in the center. Number 9. Corned beef and cabbage skillet. 2 ingredients: canned corned beef and cabbage. Canned corned beef became a pantry fixture during the Depression precisely because it required no refrigeration and no butcher, only a can opener, and whatever vegetable happened to be cheapest that week. Paired with cabbage, one of the least expensive vegetables available in nearly every season, it became a dinner that entire families in both rural and urban households leaned on through the hardest years of the decade. Here is what you need. 1 12-ounce can of corned beef broken into large chunks. Half a medium cabbage, roughly chopped. Heat a large skillet over medium-high heat with no oil required, since the corned beef contains enough fat of its own. Add the corned beef in large shanks and let it sit undisturbed for 3 full minutes. This undisturbed searing is what builds a deep, caramelized crust on the outside of the meat rather than a soft, gray texture throughout. Once browned, break it into smaller pieces with a spatula and push it to one side of the skillet. Add the chopped cabbage to the empty side and let it cook for 4 minutes, stirring occasionally until it begins to soften and pick up color at the edges. Toss the cabbage and corned beef together in the skillet and continue cooking for 3 more minutes until the cabbage is tender but still holds a slight bite. Searing the corned beef undisturbed before it touches the cabbage builds the caramelized base that carries the flavor of the entire dish. Rushing this step produces a pale, underwhelming result. Number 10. Welsh Rarebit. 2 ingredients: sharp cheddar cheese and beer. Long before it crossed the Atlantic, this dish sustained working families in Wales and England through centuries of economic hardship, and it found new relevance in Depression-era America as households discovered that a small block of cheese, stretched with a splash of beer, could produce a dinner rich enough to feel indulgent, even when the pantry held almost nothing else. Here is what you need. 2 cups of sharp cheddar cheese, freshly grated. Half a cup of beer, any variety with a slightly bitter or malty character. Warm a heavy-bottomed saucepan over low heat, never medium or high, since cheese sauce built too quickly turns grainy and separates, rather than melting smoothly. Pour in the beer and let it warm gently for 1 minute without allowing it to boil. Add the grated cheese in small handfuls, stirring continuously and waiting for each handful to melt fully before adding the next. Rushing this step, or adding all the cheese at once, causes the sauce to break into a stringy, oily mess rather than a smooth, pourable one. Continue stirring for about 4 minutes, until the entire mixture becomes glossy and coats the back of a spoon. Toast thick slices of bread separately, then pour the hot cheese sauce generously over the top, allowing it to soak slightly into the crust before serving. Follow these steps for a better experience. Low heat and small additions of cheese are the 2 conditions that separate a silky rarebit from a broken one. Freshly grated cheese also melts far more smoothly than pre-shredded cheese, since the anti-caking coating on packaged cheese resists melting evenly. Number 11. Dandelion greens with bacon drippings. 2 ingredients: dandelion greens and bacon drippings. Long before dandelions were dismissed as lawn weeds, They were treated as a genuine spring vegetable, gathered freely from fields and roadsides at a time when store-bought produce was often out of finance. You shall reach entirely. Wilted quickly in the fat saved from breakfast bacon, they became a dish that cost families nothing beyond the effort of picking them, and yet delivered a flavor deep enough to feel like a proper cooked vegetable rather than a foraged afterthought. Here is what you need. 6 cups of dandelion greens washed and roughly torn. 3 tablespoons of reserved bacon drippings. Heat the bacon drippings in a large skillet over medium heat until fully melted and shimmering, about 1 minute. Add the dandelion greens in large handfuls, allowing each addition to wilt slightly before adding the next, rather than crowding the pan all at once. Crowding traps steam and produces greens that are soggy rather than properly wilted and coated in fat. Toss continuously with tongs for about 3 minutes until every leaf is glossy and reduced significantly in volume, but still retains a slight bite rather than turning fully limp. Remove from heat immediately once that texture is reached, since residual heat continues to soften the greens even off the burner. Adding the greens gradually rather than all at once is the detail most people overlook and the one that determines whether the final dish is evenly coated in flavor or unevenly wilted and pale in places. Number 12. Cottage cheese and toast. 2 ingredients: cottage cheese and toasted bread. Nutritionists distributed this pairing widely during the Depression as a cheap, high-protein substitute for meat, and it appeared on relief agency recommendation sheets alongside dishes like mocorno, promoted specifically because a single container of cottage cheese delivered nearly as much protein as a portion of beef at a fraction of the cost. No refrigerated meat required. Here is what you need: 1½ cups of full-fat cottage cheese. For thick slices of bread, for toasting, toast the bread slices until deeply golden and firm enough to hold weight without collapsing, since a lightly toasted slice will turn soggy the moment the cottage cheese is spread across it. While the bread toasts, warm the cottage cheese gently in a small pan over low heat for about 90 seconds, just enough to take the chill off without melting it into liquid. This brief warming step is the detail almost every version of this dish skips, and it makes a noticeable difference. Softening the curds slightly so the texture spreads smoothly rather than sitting in cold. Separate clumps on the bread. Spread the warmed cottage cheese generously and evenly across each slice of toast immediately after it comes off the heat, while both the bread and the cheese are still warm. Season with a light crack of black pepper. Spatial tips from my experience: warming the cottage cheese before it touches the toast is the entire secret of this dish. Served cold and straight from the container, it tastes forgettable. Warmed briefly, it tastes considerably closer to a simple ricotta spread. And the difference costs nothing but 90 seconds. 12 dishes. 12 households that refuse to go hungry with almost nothing left to work with. These recipes were never written down for glory. They were written down, when they were written down at all, so that a daughter or a granddaughter would know what survival tasted like, and so that the knowledge would not disappear the way so much of that decade nearly did. Somewhere a version of this list is still sitting in a kitchen drawer, in handwriting none of us will ever read. Which one would you have made first, if this had been your kitchen in 1932? Tell us the number in the comments below. We read every single one, and we would genuinely like to know that new forgotten dishes arrive every day. If this history deserves to be remembered, subscribe so the next one finds you. Until then, take care of yourself. History was never made by people who had enough. It was made by people who knew how to make do.